The house was unsettlingly quiet that afternoon, the kind of silence that makes you suddenly aware of the fridge's hum or the distant chirping of birds outside. I sat alone in the living room, absent-mindedly flipping through a magazine without actually reading it. My husband, Ethan, was away on another business trip. I was used to it by now, but today, the emptiness felt more profound than usual. I glanced at my phone, hoping for a message or call, but the screen remained blank. The silence only emphasized how predictable my life had become. Routine had been a source of comfort, yet it had also built a wall around me. I loved Ethan, or at least, I had thought so, but over time, something had changed. Passion had softened into comfort, and comfort had settled into complacency. The sudden sound of a car door closing broke the stillness. Peering through the window, I saw my nephew, Jake, approaching the house. He was the son of Ethan's younger brother. I opened the door, surprised to see him standing on the porch with his usual confident grin. "Hey, Jake. What brings you here?" I asked, masking my surprise. "Uncle Ethan asked me to grab some documents he left behind," he replied, his eyes glinting with a familiar charm. "Hope it's not a bad time." I stepped aside, letting him in. "Not at all. Come on in." As he entered, I noticed how effortlessly he carried himself, bringing an unexpected energy into the room. He tossed his bag onto the couch, glancing around. "Nice place, as always." "You've got great taste, Aunt," he said with a teasing grin. I chuckled, waving off the compliment. "Flattery won't get you out of trouble." "What documents are you looking for?" Jake shrugged. "Something about property papers, I think," he said, heading toward the study. As he walked away, I found myself reflecting on how different he was from Ethan. Jake was spontaneous, charismatic, and exuded a confidence that had been absent from my life for a long time. I shook off the thought, feeling ridiculous. He was family, after all. A few minutes later, Jake returned with the papers, his sleeves rolled up, revealing a tattoo on his forearm. He caught me staring and smirked. "You like it?" he asked, amusement twinkling in his eyes. "It's interesting," I replied, feeling slightly embarrassed. We sat down and talked for a while, sharing stories and laughter. Jake's tales were lively and entertaining, a stark contrast to the monotony I had grown used to. For a brief moment, I forgot about everything: my husband, my responsibilities, the unspoken rules I had always followed. It was just Jake and me, sharing a connection I couldn't quite define. The conversation flowed effortlessly, filling the room with warmth I hadn't felt in years. Jake leaned back on the couch, his eyes meeting mine for a moment too long. There was something about the way he listened, genuinely interested in every word I said, that was disarming, almost intoxicating. At one point, he reached for a glass of water, and our hands brushed against each other. The touch was brief, but it left a lingering sensation in my mind. I instinctively pulled back, laughing it off. But I could feel the heat rise in my cheeks. Jake tilted his head slightly, studying me. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice casual yet laced with curiosity. "Of course," I said quickly, standing up to create some distance. "It's just warm in here, that's all." I busied myself in the kitchen, trying to shake off the tension, but I could still feel Jake's presence. When I turned back, he was leaning against the doorway, watching me with an unreadable expression. "You seem different today," he remarked, his voice softer than before. "Different how?" I asked, trying to sound indifferent. "I don't know. Maybe more alive," he said sincerely, his words caught me off guard. For the first time in a long while I felt seen. And that terrified me. "Jake, you should probably go soon," I said, avoiding his gaze. "Why?" he asked, stepping closer. "No reason, just." He searched my eyes, waiting for an answer I couldn't give. The space between us felt charged, heavy with unspoken words and emotions I wasn't ready to acknowledge. He was too close now, and I felt my resolve weakening. "This isn't right," I whispered, more to myself than to him. "I know," he said, his voice low and steady. "But doesn't it feel right?" I looked up at him, my heart racing. The rest of the world seemed to fade away. It was just the two of us, suspended in a moment that felt both impossible and inevitable. Jake reached out, his fingers grazing mine. I didn't pull away. The room seemed to shrink around us, the distance between us vanishing as if it had never existed. My mind screamed at me to stop, to step back, to think of the consequences, but I couldn't move. Then, just as the tension peaked, the sound of the front door opening shattered the moment. My heart leapt into my throat as Jake and I instinctively separated, both turning toward the noise. His cousin, Marcus, stood in the doorway, his expression a mix of confusion and suspicion. "Hey," Marcus said slowly, his eyes shifting between us. "Am I interrupting something?" "No, of course not," I replied, forcing a laugh that felt hollow. Jake was just leaving. He came to pick up some papers for Ethan. Jake, always composed, flashed an easy grin. "That's right." Marcus raised an eyebrow, unconvinced. "Funny. Uncle didn't mention you'd be here." Jake shrugged nonchalantly. "Didn't think it mattered. We were just catching up, nothing more." The words lingered in the air, seemingly harmless but weighted with meaning. Marcus didn't seem to buy it. His gaze rested on me for a moment too long, making my stomach twist. "Well, I'll let you two get back to whatever this is," Marcus said finally, his tone neutral but laced with something unspoken. He turned to leave, the door clicking shut behind him. The silence that followed was suffocating. Jake looked at me, his expression unreadable. "I should go," he said quietly, regret evident in his voice. I nodded, unable to find the right words. As he walked out, a strange mix of relief and longing settled over me. The house was quiet again, but the silence no longer felt comforting. It felt heavy, like the weight of a secret I wasn't sure I could carry. I sank onto the couch, staring at the empty space where Jake had been, wondering how something so fleeting could leave such a lasting mark.